Why do you always feel so profoundly alone? Even when people are walking right beside you, even when they're smiling right at you. Have you ever asked yourself why? If there is one uncomfortable truth that no one ever tells you about being a chosen one, it's this. Your path doesn't begin in the middle of a cheering crowd. It begins in the void. And I know exactly how you feel. You feel like there's an invisible wall between you and the rest of the world, a distance that no conversation ever seems to bridge. But listen to me very closely. There is absolutely nothing wrong with you. It's as if you're living behind glass, thin, transparent, yet completely impenetrable. You look outside and you see people moving, rushing, filling their days with endless noise, while you, deep down inside, are desperately searching for a melody, a different frequency. They settle for the surface, but you drown if you don't touch the very bottom of things. This heartbreaking contrast between the crowd and your inner void, between the artificial light of the world and the deep darkness you find yourself digging through, is the price of being different. And believe me, I know that sometimes this price feels way too high to pay. It makes you feel disconnected, isolated, as if you're living the life of a complete stranger. But what you call abandonment today, what your mind interprets as a cruel social isolation, is actually the highest form of protection you could ever receive. Mediocrity is contagious. The world out there is a meat grinder of expectations, of prefabricated identities, of people telling you who you should be just to make them comfortable. If you had stayed immersed in that uproar, your inner voice would have been completely suffocated. That's exactly why life stepped in. It activated a sort of invisible filtration, stripping away everything that was superficial, forcing you to simply stop. You see, a soul that has a greater purpose, a soul carrying the heavy weight of a true spiritual awakening, cannot evolve in the middle of chaos. It needs the void. It needs its old certainties to be demolished, so it can rebuild itself from scratch, without the toxic pollution of other people's opinions. That silence surrounding you today, that silence that sometimes takes your breath away at night, is not a prison. It's a sacred space. It is the only place where your true nature can finally stop accommodating everyone else and start listening to itself. When existence decides that the time has come for your true evolution, it doesn't send you a polite invitation. It pulls the ground right out from under your feet, and suddenly you find yourself free falling into an empty, unknown space. The human mind, terrified by this fall, screams one single word: rejection. You think the world is discarding you, that people are walking away because there is something deeply flawed within you. But take a deep breath and listen to this truth. The isolation you are experiencing is separation. It is not a rejection. There is a massive difference between being abandoned and being rescued. What you currently perceive as the biting cold of abandonment is nothing more than the open construction site of your inner sanctuary. Think about the environment you lived in until yesterday, the chaos of the crowds, the empty small talk, the desperate need to show off just to feel alive. A common environment inevitably forges a common mindset. And you were not born to be common. This is the price of being different. The surface world offers you an artificial warmth made of illusions and compromises, but in exchange, it asks you to surrender your soul. The silence, on the other hand, is freezing at first. It chills you to the bone. And yet, little by little, it ignites a fire inside you that nothing and no one will ever be able to put out. Deep down, you know this. You've always known it. Ever since you were a child, you felt that subtle, constant sensation of not belonging anywhere. While others played the game of chasing approval, you were sensing the invisible currents of human emotions. You felt the heavy energy in certain rooms. You caught the shades of sadness hiding behind the fake smiles of adults. You asked questions so incredibly big that they frightened those who preferred to stay asleep. This extreme sensitivity is not a manufacturing defect. It is the undeniable proof that you carry the mark of the chosen. But a vision this profound carries an immense weight. The deeper your gaze digs, the more the circus of the surface world appears distant, blurry, unbearable. And this is exactly where the rawest, most powerful shift in your spiritual growth takes place. Isolation after awakening is not a punishment for being too authentic. It's a scalpel. The universe is cutting away with ruthless and surgical precision the surface-level relationships, the ties of mere convenience, and all those identities you stitched together just to please everyone else. Does it hurt? Like hell. Losing someone you thought was a friend or feeling like an alien in your own family is a tear that burns the soul. But you are trading a temporary loss for an eternal gain. You are bartering the useless approval of the world for the immense power of returning to yourself. That distance that makes you clench your fists in the middle of the night today is not a stone wall locking you out of life. It's a sacred boundary. It is an impenetrable fence of high protection built around your energy, so that you stop bleeding out trying to make yourself understood by people who simply don't have the depth to do so. The solitude of the chosen one is the only womb capable of giving birth to your true form. And the exact moment you accept this profound separation, you stop feeling like a marginalized victim, and you finally begin to understand that you, alone, have always been the master of your destiny. There is an exact moment during this dizzying journey when you realize that no one is coming to save you. And it's terrifying, I know. You literally feel the earth crumbling beneath your shoes, leaving you suspended in a void that seems eager to swallow every old certainty you ever had. The crowds of the past, the voices of those you thought were indispensable. Everything fades, replaced by a silence that at first echoes in your chest like an inescapable death sentence. But listen to me with extreme attention. That void isn't there to break you. Isolation builds inner strength precisely because it violently rips your old crutches right out of your hands. The chosen one is never, ever pulled away from the world to be weakened or humiliated. You are isolated to become a masterpiece of self-sufficiency. Imagine the visceral difference between clinging desperately to others and standing on your own 2 feet like an oak tree in the middle of a hurricane. When you are constantly submerged in chaos, in superficial opinions, in the frantic distractions of people who live only for appearances, your inner voice is reduced to a weak whisper. But when the stage of your life empties out, when you find yourself face to face with your own demons in the dead of night, something majestic happens. The oppressive frost of that disconnection begins slowly to mutate. That biting, ruthless cold gives way to the deep warmth of an impregnable inner refuge. Your loneliness stops being a prison cell and elevates itself into sacred solitude. It becomes the ultimate training ground for your spiritual growth, where every single tear you shed crystallizes, transforming into pure resilience. The crushing trials you had to overcome, those betrayals that knocked the wind out of you, those disappointments that seemed to erase every map for your future, they were never random cruelties of fate. They were the most elite training a soul could possibly receive. Think about every time you were misunderstood and left behind. Instead of collapsing, you learned to decipher your own heart without needing a stranger to validate your feelings anymore. Think about those who smiled at you and then turned their backs. Instead of begging for their return, you sharpened your discernment, awakening an intuition so razor-sharp that you can now read a person's soul with a single glance. You are performing the greatest alchemy. You are transforming a devastating loss into the most priceless gain of your entire existence. The universe knows perfectly well that whoever carries the weight and responsibility of a true awakening cannot afford to live dangling by the thread of other people's approval. If your worth was tied to the applause of the crowd, you would forever be a slave to their mood swings. The solitude of the chosen one steps in specifically to sever this toxic human addiction right at the root. It forces you to walk blindfolded in the dark, feeling the walls of your own pain until you find the switch to your very own light. And when you finally touch that indestructible core of awareness, you realize that this isolation didn't take the world away from you at all. It simply gave you back to yourself, forging a sovereign individual who no longer needs to ask anyone for permission to exist. There is an invisible law that governs human evolution, a raw truth that completely escapes those who constantly live on the surface. Isolation always precedes the mission. When you look around and see nothing but emptiness, when the freezing cold of loneliness seems to have paralyzed every perspective and the ground is literally giving way beneath you, your frightened mind whispers that it's the end. But listen to your breathing. Slow down. That is not the curtain falling on your existence. It is the necessary darkness that precedes the dawn of your true calling. Think about how you felt these past few months. Old friendships dissolving like dust in the wind, the chaos of daily habits being brutally replaced by an absolute deafening silence. It's a violent tear. And yet in this exact moment, your solitude is performing its most profound miracle. You are walking through the corridor of invisibility. Before you can radiate an authentic, solid light in the middle of the crowd, you must first learn to navigate your own shadows without being swallowed whole. This is the raw, real essence of spiritual growth. If the universe had left you immersed in the noise, in the desperate need for approval, you would have continued to pollute your essence with the desires and fears of others. Instead, it stripped you down. It took away everything that was toxic and unnecessary to reveal the only thing that truly matters, your indestructible core. This is what the price of being different looks like. You must have the courage to accept the temporary loss of a world that no longer looked like you in order to gain the absolute victory of a life mission that vibrates in perfect synchrony with your soul. And look at what is happening. The biting cold of that initial disconnection, day after day, is already transforming into the warmth of an inner sanctuary where only authenticity is allowed to enter. It's a magnificent paradox. You are isolated from the world, specifically to be prepared to return to the world. But pay close attention. Your return will not be a pitiful prayer to be accepted or understood once again. Whoever walks through the fire of sacred solitude and comes out forged no longer begs for a seat at the table of mediocrity. You don't come back to please the expectations of people who are sleepwalking through life. You don't come back to blend in with the herd. You return to lead. The forced absence of distractions has forged an identity in you so deeply rooted, so terrifyingly powerful, that no criticism and no external rejection will ever be able to tear it down again. You stopped begging the outside world for direction simply because now you are the compass. When you finally emerge from this period of painful but sacred retreat, you will do so with a frequency that will leave anyone who meets your gaze absolutely speechless. The crowd, which once made you feel inadequate and lost, will simply become the field where you plant the seeds of your new awareness. You will no longer be the outcast suffering on the sidelines, but you will become an unshakable lighthouse for all those who are still drowning in the sea of illusions. That frightening void, that sense of vertigo and total alienation that kept you awake for endless nights, was not a life sentence. It was simply the immense, empty sky your soul desperately needed, so it could finally remember how to fly. If you have made it this far, if you felt your chest resonate with these words, take a deep breath. Let it go. Drop your shoulders, release that invisible tension you've been carrying around for way too long. Enough. You no longer have to fight against yourself, desperately trying to fit into a world that is suffocatingly small for you. All that pain, that absolute sense of vertigo, That stinging sensation of walking barefoot in total darkness while everyone else seemed to be dancing in the sunlight. It wasn't a punishment. It was simply the price of being different. But I ask you to look past it now. The longest, coldest night, the one where you believed you had been forgotten by everyone, is finally fading. Do you feel the air changing? Do you feel how your breathing suddenly becomes sweeter, lighter? That empty space that kept you awake, terrified until yesterday, is now overflowing with a silent peace. Untouchable, you have finally understood that your isolation was never a prison. It was never a final destination where you were supposed to wither away in loneliness. It was a bridge, a magnificent, dizzying bridge suspended over the abyss of your fears that you necessarily had to cross entirely alone to trigger your true inner transformation. Life pulled you away from the noise for the sweetest reason. It needed you to recognize your own frequency. It prepared you, in absolute silence, to bring you face to face with the bravest choice a human being can ever make. To stop existing just to please the expectations of others and to start living to honor yourself. Don't look back at your past with bitterness anymore. You were never discarded. You were never a mistake. You were simply being forged. And now that the fire has died down and the hammer has stopped striking, you are ready. Because in the end, the true majesty of a soul isn't found in having avoided loneliness. It is found in having embraced the deepest darkness of the world, only to discover, with infinite sweetness, that you were always the one and only indispensable source of light.